Hello and welcome to another Bolt Action Deep Dive with Zorvix.
You know, what keeps Germany in that bottom tier? Again, maybe the transport options, but
That was a clip from a recent SNAFU podcast interview with a notable player, Alistair, who made a statement regarding the German transport options are a factor of why Germany is not as strong as some of the other nations. I really liked that comment and wanted to evaluate it a little bit further and maybe even to look into some options on how to mitigate that downfall. All the images in this video are owned by Warlord Games. In order to establish a control group, I wanted to explore some information from a competitive event, namely the upcoming Danish Nationals. This is a 40-person event, and if you look closely at the list submitted, it's easy to classify it as what the cool kids nowadays call sweaty. For inexperienced squads, they were being brought at just under 11 men, regular squads between 7 and 8 men, which is a good category for an 8-man transport. Similarly, the veterans are just under 7 men, and squads with flamethrowers in them were just over 5 men. Lastly, small team options will want to look for a transport for those. German-specific players, on the other hand, did not take as many inexperienced squads, and those were smaller than average. Regular squads fell exactly within that 7 to 8 range. However, veterans were all between the 5 and 6 range. And lastly, the squads with flamethrowers were also 5 or 6 men. The next two slides are kind of an info dump of the top 4 transports being used at that event, as well as in my personal experience. The truck is by far the most used at 27 quantity. These are 39 points, a transport value of 12, and these are just over 3 points per transport. Half of those being used had a pintle-mounted MMG, and then there were a handful that used the half-track option in whatever variety they wanted. Next up is the Bren carrier. About half of that usage, 60 points, these have transport 5, with a considerable amount of 12 points per transport. They don't seem that efficient in its face value. However, every single one of those had a pintle weapon, and it comes with a stacked hull LMG. So they do have those 2 weapons and can put out a considerable amount of supporting fire. With armor 7, they are immune to small arms and cannot be destroyed. The smallest transport available is the Jeep or the Kubelwagen at 21 points. There were 11 of those. They come with transport 3, and it may not seem like it, but these are one of the least point efficient vehicles at 5.25, but they are intended for those small teams. The Fiat 508 and the Kuragane also made an appearance, but those two are available to nations who don't have the Jeep or the Kubelwagen and do have to pay that extra 2 points just for that capacity. The Dodge 3/4 ton and the 15 CWT are the 8-person transports. These come in at 31 points. There were 11 of these. These are a very considerable 3.9 points per transport, and every single one of them used had a pintle weapon. It is interesting to note just how many of these were used and multiples in those lists, because they are only available to the US and Great Britain. Just by looking at these 4 transports, it's easy to see that the largest and smallest are the same ones that Germany has access to that other nations are using. This is a good indication that people are looking for that medium-sized transport for their basic squads. With regards to the German transports that have 12 men, at 6 plus armor is the truck. Again, 39 points, may add a pintle MMG. You can swap that out and make it a tracked version, same cost but no machine gun option. The half-track versions are just that additional 5 points. And then at 7 plus armor is the SDKFC 4, the 251-1 Hanomag, and the Unic P107. The truck itself may appear efficient. It's got only just over 3 points per transport, but the armor 6 is kind of the drawback. It can die to rifle fire and small arms. If you carve out those MMG upgrades of the armor 7 vehicles, you're looking at just under 5.75 points per transport capacity. The hardest part is who are you going to put in those? Germany typically lacks that squad of that size, that's going to want to be pushed forward, that needs that mobility. Typically, your inexperienced squads are going to be 5 or 6 men and focused on holding backline objectives. They might provide some minimal covering fire or something along those lines and don't need the transport itself. In order to utilize the full potential of a 12-man transport, you'd have to focus on the machine gun usage and either use a full strength squad or maybe even multiple squads in that. If you are using 2 smaller squads, remember that these vehicles are susceptible to small arms fire, being open topped or only 6 armor, and that's often not a situation you want to put your units into. Little gripe here, the half-track truck that the Soviets have access to is the exact same 44 points as the multi-air SDKFC. However, the MMG option is only 10 points. I suspect that is left over from version 1 of the game and is something that could use a little cleaning up. Next up is the German transports that are in the category of 8 to 10 men. And for 6 plus armor, there's none. In fact, this is where Germany suffers the most. Britain gets the 15 and 30 CWTs, and US gets the Dodge 3/4 10. This remains to be the biggest gap in German army lists, especially considering, as we saw earlier, most of the squads being used are 7 to 8 men. If we use the 12-man transports, that's a lot of wasted space in those trucks and vehicles, and effectively wasted points, and it can feel bad. For Armor 7 vehicles, the latest March 2022 errata introduced the P107 command half-track. Unfortunately, it's just overcosted and doesn't have enough usefulness for those points. The Stummel, the 251/9, has potential, but it doesn't necessarily want to push too far forward. It has a light howitzer and a Pintle MMG and is great for covering fire. However, it's got that transport aid, but takes up the tank slot. It's not something you want to move up the field very often. Finally, the 251/10 comes in at an expensive 141 points, but includes an AT gun as well as the command vehicle upgrade. This unit might be good on strict order dice limits, but often gets outperformed by cheaper, more dedicated transports. Consider this: take a PaK 36 light AT gun and a Hanomag, and you're at almost the exact same points. Next up is the German 6-man transports. At a mere 18 points, the horse wagon introduced by the 2 recent D-Day books. It's a great way to add inexpensive transports, but at the risk of easy death. 3 plus armor is going to be susceptible to everything. Sneezing at it is going to make it die. And that's not something you want to add that D6 hits and going down on your unit inside. The heavy field car is occasionally seen because it fits the criteria of the Transport 6, Armor 6. However, it lacks any guns for fire support and can die to small arms. For an extra 5 points, you can have a half-track capacity 6 vehicle. For similar reasons, as we've stated above, the artillery schlepper is one of the worst transports available to Germany. It is 7 plus 57 points for just a tracked 6-man. All of the German 5-man transports have armor 7, and let's consider those possibilities for those minimum size squads. There's 2 command half-tracks. One is enclosed, the other one's open-topped with an MMG. It's essentially the difference, but again, these are coming in at 90 and 105 points respectively, and are tough to fit into lists and legitimize for just transport capacity 5. The Bren carrier. Here we go. Germany's got access to it in the Ostfried book. 60 points. However, it is only limited to those book theater selectors. The SDKFC 250/1 Alta half-track. At 70 points, it is open-topped, and it has a Pinto MMG. This is a good spot to make a direct comparison between the Bren carrier that we saw 13 selected of, and the just 1 or 2 Altas that were selected. They have considerable mobility, with the Bren having turn on the spot, being tracked. The Alta has a Pinto-mounted MMG, so it's got those 6 shots. The Bren carrier's got a Hull LMG and an option for a Pinto LMG. Now, the basic difference between them is only 1 die other than the German special rule, which means that that 1 die is 15 points. This is typically considered a mistake because the version 2 rulebook lists the Bren carrier price at 70 points, and the Armies of Great Britain book still only lists it at 60 points under version 1, which is what is used. The smallest of the German transports all have armor 6. That's a typo. The Kubelwagen coming in at 21 points has transport 3. You can add, make it a half-track version, Kettenkrad. It's going to be 26 points, and similarly, the Schwimmwagen is 26 points for transport 3, but gains amphibious instead. Of note, the Waffen SS Schwimmwagen at 31 points appears pretty good on face value. It has that MG option, so at plus 15 points, it keeps its transport 4 and amphibious. However, it's gated behind using both the 4-man Waffen SS Aufklärung squad and an officer. So maybe including as a one-of can be decent if you want it for your flamethrower and then send your squad somewhere else. But it's something to consider, as it can be used in the generic reinforced platoon. So, in conclusion, Germany doesn't have a good 8-man transport or regular squad transport like other nations. So we need to look at some of the solutions. And here I've got a picture of the upcoming STKFC 250 Alta half track that's going to be available soon. Props to Warlord for recognizing that. So the first solution is to suck it up. Realize that Germany's greatest strengths in their army composition lies in their variety of infantry and their weapons. We need to look for ways to work around this rather than just brute forcing through it. While not as good as the Bren carrier, the Alta is only 15 points worse and can still transport 5 men safely. It's something to consider using for those 5 men that you really need to keep safe and have the mobility on. You can drop your main squads down just a little bit and use the heavy field car. This is the focus on a 6-man squad, and while this transport doesn't have a weapon option, it can still provide that maneuverability. Just remember to keep it safe. The opposite way is to increase your squad sizes. Use larger squads, like the inexperienced Heldenklau, or in the D-Day, in the Italy book, the Fallschirmjäger squad that has pistols. Those have 12 men and are potential great frontline units that won't feel like a waste when using a truck. Next up are evaluating some of the weapon options or alternatives to spending your points on transports. Let's take a look at an LMG, that German LMG team from the Battle of France book that nobody uses. That is amazing, 35 points, and can give you some of that covering fire to get your units into position. Similarly, using indirect fire, howitzers, mortars, multi-launchers, things like that can force your enemy to move into you where you've dug in. That can be an alternative by spending your points on those instead of having to have mobility for your troops. The primary purpose of using a transport is to increase mobility. And if we don't have the transport for that, we can consider options such as adding those points into the infantry unit itself. For example, pictured here, the Begliet Stug Riders or any of the tank riders. In the Ostfront book, those units have assault gun transport rule for free. There is no additional cost for that. They have slightly more limited weapon loadout options, but that can be a great way to escort your tanks up the field and add some mobility to those. Additionally, there's bicycles. Although it's probably one of the worst on this list, it's a good thing to keep in mind as the mindset of getting around the lack of that 7 to 10 transport option. Next up, the cavalry options. There is, in the armies of Germany, the Waffen SS cavalry can have horses for only 2 points per model. This adds mobility, the ability to recce essentially, and tough fighter while mounted. The only thing you're losing is the ability to go down, but at 2 points per model, that's better than any of the transport options as far as efficiency for adding that mobility. Forward deployers. There are at least 6 infantry squads that I found going through the German army units that have the forward deployability. use these units to start in more favorable positions, and that can often downplay the need for transports. There are often costs with that, increase in points costs, and a reduction in weapon options, but these are additional ways to look into that. The home ground rule that was added in the Fortress Budapest book is only +1 point per model, and this rule has the added benefit of making reserve rolls easier and is a personal favorite of mine to get those units from first wave into the battlefield a little bit faster and have that extra mobility and make the enemy react to what you are doing. Motorbikes are something that I've tried to make work since the beginning of my bolt action experience. In fact, it's the reason I started Germany. But I have to admit, they are the worst on this list. At +5 points per model, they are just not competitive in any manner, the way the rules are written right now. However, mountaineering is a great keyword. The Jaeger Squad from the Stalingrad book can have mountaineering for only +1 point per model, and again, they're giving up something. They have a quite limited weapon loadout. Thank you all for listening to this. Let me know if there are any transports that I missed or maybe ways that you use to work around the lack of that mid-range transport. And always have a wonderful day.